Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar presented by ADRA International, ADRA Afro, and also the Education ETLL. It's a review of school feeding initiatives implemented from 2017 to 2022 in the Horn and Southern African countries. We thank you all for coming. And we also want to extend a special welcome to our researchers, and Dr. Ann Corwith, Kella, Merlain-Moffatt, and Pascal Pax Andebo. They were the research team that looked at the ADRA's school feeding practice during that period of time. So it included not only schools that were in the development, you want to say the development sector, but also in the emergency, and looking at the triple nexus as to how were some successfully transitioned into a development from emergency and some that couldn't. So we thank you for joining us. So some few ground rules as we get started is that we will basically have approximately 30 minutes for the presentation, and at the end we'll have a Q&A session that will be also 30 minutes. And then for those who want to stay further and ask even some more detailed technical questions, we will leave it open for those discussions to happen. But we'll also end the recording and also allow those who cannot stay longer that they can leave. But other than that, we ask for you to be on mute. If you have any questions, please feel free to utilize the chat feature. The presenters they may allow some time, let's say, for questions, but the majority of the questions we will wait till the end. So without further ado, I want to introduce the lead researcher, Dr. Ann Corwith, who will introduce our team and also start with the presentation. All right. Dr. Ann, all is yours now.
Thank you, Billy. Let me just get my slides going. So everybody can see that.
Yes.
Okay, good. So good morning, good evening, and good day. And thank you for joining us and for giving us the opportunity to present our research. I'm going to let Kella actually give a little bit of presentation for Pascal, her and I a little bit later, but we want to especially thank Billy for the opportunity to conduct this research, and also to the ADRA International and Country Office staff who gave their time to inform the study. So the overall purpose of the research is to review ADRA's school feeding programs to help improve its services to people in crises. Today, we'll present stage 1 of the research as we understand it. As part of the research, we conducted an in-depth literature review. The review looked at best practices in school feeding and the concept of the Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus. School feeding includes 4 sectors of the Sustainable Development Goals: food security, health, wash, and livelihoods. We will highlight good practices and challenges as captured in the ADRA project reports and interviews with ADRA staff. We also include our recommendations based on the literature review. So I will now turn it over to Pascal to provide the context.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Anne, for this opportunity. The context in which ADRA, or the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, as we would want to call it in full, got involved in school feeding initiatives is based on also a historical context in which they have been involved in this programming, especially in Africa, since 2005. So it wasn't really something completely new to ADRA that they would implement. And the projects that we particularly will be reviewing are those which started as a result of the El Nino drought that hit Southern African countries between 2015 and 2016, which led to a situation of high food insecurity that then necessitated this project. And based on that, ADRA International supported the country offices in Eswatini, Malawi, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe to respond to this emergency, while ADRA International also collaborated with partners which supported in fundraising and also with other logistical support to support the country offices to design the school feeding initiative proposals, to also help in implementing the project, support with in-country logistics, and also aspects like the monitoring and evaluation of this project as it went on. And for the project, in context that we are reviewing, the goals which started, especially at the beginning, were mainly three. These were the improved nutritional status for school-going children. That was one goal that was intended. The other goal was also to increase enrollment and attendance rates in schools, especially at this critical time where many children would be actually forced to leave going to school. And then the third was the involvement of staff, local community, and the private sector in the implementation of this project. However, as time went on and implementation continued, ADRA also considered other goals as well. One of these included the improved access to clean water, sanitation facilities, and hygienic school environment. This was added in 2018 and necessitated by the fact that the school feeding initiatives required clean water, especially in food preparation. And then later also related to this, again, there was the goal of sustainable homegrown school feeding, which was added together with income-generating activities to support this project. And according to our findings, this was in 2021, and it was actually related to the sustainability aspect of the project as ADRA looked at how the future of the school feeding initiative would be. Thank you.
When it comes to the methodology, scope, and timeline, I first want to say that we are a 3-member independent research team. Pascal and Anne are both affiliated with the University of Maryland, and I'm affiliated with Teachers College Columbia University. We first convened in December 2022 and worked on this research until about July of 2023. And after developing a literature review, as Anne mentioned, we then went on to create a research framework, which really shaped how we were going to look at all of the project proposals and project reports. And so we reviewed proposals and project reports in 5 Southern African countries and then created case studies for them. And we were looking at data that was reported between 2017 to 2022. And so for those countries, they were Eswatini, Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. And then we also reviewed 4 countries in the Horn of Africa, and we looked at the proposals and reports that were from 2010 to 2022. So we had a bit more data there. And then we went ahead and created case studies for Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, and Uganda. As we were going through the reports and proposals, we had questions that arose. And so we decided that it would be wise to ask the people who developed the proposals and who also followed the projects on the ground. And so we ended up interviewing 9 key ADRA stakeholders, and we did that virtually on Zoom for up to 2 hours each. And that led to our 139-page report that you all have access to review for a deeper dive. But today we'll present on our framework by reporting out on readiness to learn, cross-cutting issues, and the Humanitarian-Peace Development Nexus. And I'll turn it over to Pascal to get us started.
Okay, thank you once again, Kella. Considering the framework that was adopted for the analysis, of course, as Kella already highlighted, one of the areas of focus was the issue of readiness to learn, because this was, I think, one of the key things considered at the very beginning to enable children to keep going to school, to get them ready to learn even in this critical moment. And as we reviewed the project reports and the context of the project in regard to this ready to learn, areas of success that we were able to identify in most project contexts or locations was that there was a report of increase in enrollment and attendance due to the provision of these school meals. So in a way, these acted as incentive to draw children to continue attending even at this critical time. And then reports also indicated overall improvement in the nutritional status of the students, especially when they were measured to ascertain the changes that occurred due to the food nutrients that they got administered to them. And key among here, which was, I think, commonly used by the different project locations, was to do the mid-upper arm circumference measurement, or in our reports, you would see it as MUOC, and this was rather common or commonly used to see improvement, and that was what the reports indicated progress or improvement in. Then ADRA offices also showed indications of working, especially with the ministries of health, to provide other health-related interventions. One which kind of got mentioned, although not in all project contexts, was the deworming aspect. But of course, as indicated, it was mentioned in some, but not like a prominent one in all the project contexts. Then another area of success, which we highlighted in these reports, was that there were WASH interventions that became necessary in all the project locations because clean water was considered crucial for providing or for cooking food, and therefore ADRA interventions therefore had to install or, where necessary, repair infrastructure to provide this clean water. And then this also led to adding or incorporating other WASH activities such as hand washing, menstrual hygiene management, and training of students and teachers in hygiene practices in the school context to accompany the school feeding initiatives that were being conducted. Then, of course, regarding the successes, our assessment also considered that certain aspects of this implementation of the project needed to consider some critical areas of adjustment, which mainly now would perhaps be aspects that can be considered for any future implementation. So in this regard, again, we identified aspects like the need for country offices to consider record keeping, because in the reports, it indicated that some teachers were sometimes absent, and also there were no record books, and therefore it affected in some extent, rather to some extent, the record keeping about school attendance and school enrollment. Then there was also reports about cases of absence of students who had already been enrolled under this project, but eventually started kind of falling off because of things like holiday activities, going back home to provide labor for the family, especially, I think, during famine, and then issues of early marriage and other unknown reasons. So this tended to water down some aspects of the success that we mentioned earlier. Then there was the question of equipment that seemed to have not been provided timely and hindered the project implementation. For example, in some reports, there were indications of how delays in measuring the improvement in learners' nutrition levels due to equipment which were not provided in time. And we thought such could be considered in future implementation for improved results and also improved achievement of the project goals. Then there was the question of some health interventions which we thought could be related to this school feeding initiative, but which were not prominently reported. For example, things related to, for example, eyesight and hearing examinations, which we thought could be attached to the implementation of this project, were not reflected in the reports. Then, in the case of the worst aspect or the worst outcomes of the project, we noticed that the reports indicated the volunteers had sometimes to be relied on to get water or clean water for the cooking. And in some other cases, there was the use of students to bring water from home or wherever they could get. So we thought that this would put an extra stress on the students and the volunteers who were supporting the project, and therefore future implementation could take care of this to ensure that this additional burden would not be put on this category, so that it would improve success of the achievements of the project. Then, in our general recommendations regarding these results that we have reported about in the aspect of readiness to learn, we therefore highlighted some issues or rather areas for recommendations that ADRA can take note of. One is to provide aspects of nutrition, health, WASH, and infrastructure or equipment that is related to these, so as to encourage the students to continue attending and be ready to learn. And these are aspects which we think could be considered right from the planning stage so that it wouldn't affect the implementation. Next, we also recommended that the program should highlight indicators which would focus on both the humanitarian response of the project and also later, as it continued implementation into the development phase, this should reflect also development indicators so as to ensure that students, rather, for example, indicators like students' retention and from year to year, or other long-term and short-term indicators are properly reflected to reflect all the achievements that the project was able to make. Then, because of the rather delays that we mentioned earlier, that the project should consider establishing infrastructure, as I said earlier, to ensure that it is successfully implemented in terms of what the required activities are, and also avoid delays so that the full impact of the project can be realized. Then, as part of the recommendations that we made regarding our assessment, we also thought that there is need for other country offices to continue to strengthen their collaboration with national and local governments and other partners like the private partners and also other NGOs engaged in similar program activities, so as to, again, avoid aspects like maybe duplication of activities and also quite adequately utilize the resources that could be pulled together in such kind of collaboration. Thank you.
We were asked to look at 3 cross-cutting issues, those being gender-based violence, disability, and climate/sustainability. And we saw lots of successes and areas of improvement in those areas. And so when it comes to gender-based violence, we saw that overall the programs reported that girls and boys benefited from the school feeding initiatives. And we think this can be credited to the fact that ADRA really went ahead and held sensitivity trainings for the community. And ADRA staff also reported extensively on early childhood marriages. And so because children could now be in school, it really did help them to be in school and learn and have food instead of having to get married in order to fulfill that need. But we also saw that there were some areas of improvement. We noticed that across the reports that gender-based violence, there was a lack of consistency in the definition and how exactly the school feeding initiatives can help to combat it directly and intentionally. When interviewing, it seems that for gender-based violence, it was something that was secondary and was able to benefit from the SFI, but having an intentional approach can really be beneficial. And then when it came to disability, we noticed that some reports said that students with disabilities were served. And there was even a member of a school feeding committee who had a disability, but it was not identified as to what the disability consisted of. And so that did raise questions around what do disabilities in these various communities look like, and how are they understood and spoken about and discussed in the forefront. And so when it comes to areas of improvement, we felt that schools and institutions for children with disabilities that were in the areas of the project, they were not included in the SFIs. And then also the definition of disability and reporting on the involvement of children and adults with disabilities was also inconsistent. And when it comes to climate change and sustainability, we saw that smart agricultural practices were taught to those who are starting school gardens or who are involved in the homegrown school feeding projects and income generating activities. And yet still, we see that climate change and sustainability were not clearly defined or tracked in the project reports. And then one issue that we thought was really important to add was this idea of resilience, because we did see it was a key component in the SFI proposals, as it was stated that the project itself would improve students' resistance or resilience, I should say, but it was not defined in any clear way or measured in any clear way. And so that brings us to our recommendations, where we feel that ADRA should really define what the organization's approach is to these cross-cutting issues and how exactly these cross-cutting issues are going to be addressed in very intentional ways. We think it's important to provide training and to also review the staff's adherence to addressing these cross-cutting issues. And we also believe that it's important to look towards adding additional Indigenous practices for addressing climate change and sustainability, especially to ensure that the work that's being done on the ground is going to be contextual. And then we also think it's important to include schools and institutions for children with disabilities in the SFIs so that they too are able to gain from all that the projects have to offer.
So then we turn to the Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus. And the Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus looks to the sustainability of projects and bridging that initial humanitarian response to development and including aspects of building peace. And so in this aspect, we found that the ADRA country offices reported on their collaborations with national governments and international and local partners. However, there were some challenges with that, with the communication, in that, for example, one of the schools in one of the areas actually wasn't functioning, and so there wasn't a program going on at the school, and there was never a communication about that. And then other aspects that we saw were some reported overlaps in services being provided. So this isn't actually, an ADRA per se issue that could be addressed. Obviously, this has to be in coordination, collaboration with the national and local governments and with the collaborating partners, but for ADRA to continue working on those relationships. Second, for management and training, the country offices held or organized training in food preparation, hygiene, and agriculture, providing increased knowledge and skills for community members. Yet there was no evidence of training on management of the school feeding program or retention of staff and the succession planning to ensure the sustainability of the projects. It was indicated from the beginning of the El Niño response that funding would be available for 3 years. Although efforts were made to develop private-public partnerships, long-term goals to transition to locally supported programming was not evident. And then lastly, the reports did not indicate efforts to help the community identify future risks and how they would prepare or respond to them. So turning to our recommendations based on this, one of the first aspects is that we think ADRA should establish longer-term goals with measurement indicators that include the sustainability and the resilience of the programming. The country staff continue to strengthen their relationships with their partners, and the consideration is given to the structure of school feeding programs to include paid staff with greater accountability, management, training, and succession planning. Based on the 2022 African Union Guidelines on Homegrown School Feeding, for the programs to increase support for smallholder farmers and locally raised livestock to provide meals for schools. The program should monitor the amount of time and responsibility placed on teachers and students in school agriculture and income generating activities to ensure that they are not more focused on those activities rather on the education process. And to enhance the sustainability, we recommend that longer-term sustainable funding mechanisms be considered that include a transition plan from external to local support. This should include the community developing private-public partnerships and reaching out to school alumni. That was one of the reports provided a positive story about school alumni involvement. And lastly, helping the community to develop contingency planning for future disaster response and including children in that discussion, making sure that the children are also involved.
Moving forward, we feel like there are a number of areas where research can be furthered. Since the third year of the SFIs implemented coincided with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is essential to conduct research on the activities carried out by the country offices, both prior to the pandemic and in response to the challenges that were posed by lockdowns, social distancing, and supply chain disruptions. And this research will allow us to see how they align with the triple nexus approach and contribute to long-term sustainability of the SFIs. Additional research is recommended as well on the engagement and retention of ADRA country office staff to implement SFI programs. Several reports commented on difficulties in finding staff, as well as challenges that the staff had in traveling to all of the school sites to monitor the programs effectively. And further research can be done on the opportunities and limitations of funding for SFIs regarding accessibility, flexibility, and timelines, as they may highlight areas where processes can be streamlined and longer-term investment can be considered.
So we understand that stage 2 of the research, if ADRA decides to proceed with it, will be to compare ADRA's school feeding programs to those implemented by other organizations. And then the last stage of the research would be to seek information from community members and stakeholders. This stage will measure the impact, effectiveness, and sustainability of ADRA school feeding programs on the ground. So again, we want to thank you for the opportunity to present our research, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Kella. Thank you, Pascal. We really appreciate it. We want to open up the floor for questions at this time. I'm sure some of you have some questions. Any questions, I think, is fair. If there is a term that you didn't understand, feel free to share. But thank you all for your contribution. Anybody has any questions? Okay, I guess while people are gathering their thoughts, I do have, well, first of all, I want to highlight your comments about the need to include children in the disaster response, disaster risk management, and also risk assessments. Sometimes I think we do try to do let's say some risk assessments and also involve, let's say, the communities, but we overlook, I think, children in the process. They have some key insights that I think sometimes we don't appreciate much. But one of the questions that I do have is when it comes to indicators. There are a lot of indicators out there, let's say, to measure progress, to measure health, nutrition, WASH, all these in education outcomes. What are your recommendations as to where to find the best indicators? The reason why is because sometimes the local government have its own indicators that, let's say, that might conflict with ADRA's indicators. Let's say the government define children between the age of 0 to 18, but then we at ADRA use an indicator that define children as age 5 to 16. So I guess how do we maintain a ground where everybody can win, and where should the priority be? Should it be in the local indicators or one that ADRA, let's say, come up with?
So I'll respond to that, and Kella and Pascal, feel free to add anything that I might have missed. But I think ADRA should, because it is ADRA's programming, ADRA should follow its indicators that it has established. Obviously, you want to work in partnership with the national government, and be able to have that dialogue with the national government to be able to provide, if the national government is asking for your information, that you can provide reporting to them. But as ADRA is implementing the project, it should follow its indicators to achieve its goals. Obviously, one of the things I would like to say also is just a caveat on our research is that, first of all, we're looking at what the project reports are reporting back to us. And we did find that there is a lot of activity going on the ground that I think is just difficult for ADRA staff to capture. There were a lot of things that came up in the interviews that that are not easily captured by indicators. And so that as well is something to just keep in mind with our research, in that there may be things that we brought up as areas of concern or recommendations that may actually be happening on the ground, but just were not clearly represented in either the reporting or the interviews that we conducted. So keep that in mind. And second of all, this Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, it really is a collaboration that's coming from hopefully the national governments. And so it's not, ADRA's role in that has to be this one of collaboration where ADRA is really trying to work with the national government, and has limitations, obviously. You can only, based on the capability of the national government to be able to do these things. And so, where ADRA can try to improve communications or improve the collaborations or things like that, that's kind of where we hope that can happen. But obviously it's, you're dealing with the partners that you're working with and their capabilities.
Yeah, thank you. And Kella or Pascal, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to the question of which I guess standards to follow when it comes to indicators, and which one should be given more priority. So if you wanted to add anything to that, feel free.
Well, my suggestion in this will not be quite different from what Anne has said, because first, I believe ADRA would have also, like we said earlier, developed its goals in terms of what do we want to achieve with implementing such a project. And this certainly has to be informed by, first of all, what the country offices find in the local context, but also what ADRA as a body, as an international body, targets to achieve. So there's this kind of horizontal and vertical connection that comes with it. Therefore, ADRA would be right to be guided by the kind of values and the policies to determine the indicators that they want to achieve. But of course, there is this constant dialogue that must be going on, especially at country level, in terms of what they can do with the local partners. And in this, I think the benefit is that this becomes a kind of sharing of knowledge from which there's a learning that goes on between or among the partners, like in government or in the level of the organizational partners that are involved, so that it becomes an opportunity to come up with something which actually works for the local context, but also helps ADRA in achieving its targeted goals in such an intervention, because it has these different layers of partners to interact with and report to. Thank you.
Thanks, Pascal. Kella, nothing to add. It's okay. We have a lot of questions, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity. Thank you for all the questions that are coming in. I'll start with the first one that I see. It's from Emily. So she's asking, how do the findings compare to school feeding initiatives implemented by other institutions and NGOs? I know we did talk about the need for more research, let's say for us to compare with them. So, but I guess from experience, from the research team, how would you compare, let's say, our school feeding initiatives or school feeding programs within the context of, let's say, Africa versus, others? Any comments?
I would say from my end, we didn't look at that specifically for this stage of the research process. What we looked at was the literature on school feeding itself and the benefits that it provides to children. And so basically it was kind of looking at the argument for why school feeding. Why is that important? And why is that important, even especially during an emergency time period? And so, and that's why we, instead of talking about school feeding, we position it as readiness to learn, because that is what the literature speaks to, is that readiness to learn for the child not to be hungry, for the child to be in good health, so that they could actually take in what they're learning. And so that talks to their the nutrition level being high enough and sufficient enough for their cognitive abilities to be able to learn. And so we didn't focus on looking at other NGOs or other organizations, school feeding initiatives. I don't know, Pascal or Kella, if any of your outside research is related to this, but
Yeah, I think it might be the next phase of the research is, I think one thing that we discovered is that before we compare ourselves with other organizations, we need to understand what we do first. So that was one of the reasons why we needed to understand, well, what is ADRA's practice, specifically with Africa? And now that we have something to that's more definitive, then I think it would be the next stage is understanding what to do. Yeah, so I'd say these are great questions, and we're gonna continue to answer them as promptly as possible. So thank you for that, Emily. We have two questions regarding child protection coming from David and John. So I guess, we'll just consolidate them. It's basically about child protection, how it was reported or highlighted as a cross-cutting issue. It didn't seem to be talked about. So I don't know if it's something that you want to elaborate on. Was it the reporting that didn't highlight it, or the progress? And by SFI, I just want to make sure that we understand that we're talking about the Southern African countries, I think, that participated. But you also had the Horn of African countries that were recently activated, and they didn't have time to, let's say, go through those deep dives. But let me share that question to the team. Was child protection something that was considered?
So I can start with this one. Child protection as a cross-cutting issue was not something that was centered within the proposals and the reports. It really focused on gender-based violence, climate change and sustainability, and then I don't know why I'm missing one all of a sudden.
Disability.
Thank you. Disability. There we go. And so those were the three ones that were really the core within the proposals and the reports. When we were conducting interviews, we noticed that child protection was something that was conflated with gender-based violence. And we think that occurred because of the lack of definition surrounding gender-based violence specifically. But we also know that, I believe in Mozambique, that when it came to actually addressing gender-based violence-related activities, that was led by a child protection officer. And so we do see these instances where there are folks on the ground who focus specifically on child protection, who have a hand and are playing a really large role in the SFI. But then we also see that there is some conflation happening. We also did see in our interviews that lots of people spoke about the ways in which they have gone about protecting children and the different systems that have been put in place, whether formally or informally. And so there are discussions about child protection when we had those conversations, but they weren't necessarily focused on specifically within the reports and in the programs to be reported on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Kella. That's a great observation. And it goes back to, I think, the recommendations about defining these different areas, because there might be some, I don't want to say misunderstanding, but different ways of, let's say, seeing child protection. Some contexts see it as sort of like a fusion of gender-based violence, which I've seen, but having it clearly defined, I think, is really important. So thanks for bringing for answering that. So for our next question, it's coming from James, and he says I seem to miss the value addition of involving the private sector in SFI. Was this looked into? So when we did talk about the recommendation for private public partnership, I think he's referring to that. Was it something that was highlighted, or what's the value of involving, specifically to his question, like the private sector and sustaining, let's say, a project? What would be your answer to that?
So I'll take that one. So I also want to clarify that we looked at the 5 countries that started with the El Nino response, and because those were the countries where we had consistent reporting over a course of the 3 years of the implementation of those projects. And then we had the additional countries that we looked at. And there is a wide variety of how countries are implementing their school feeding initiatives and what capabilities they're able to implement as far as developing these private public partnerships, even the school agricultural or income generating activities. And so we focused on predominantly the 5 countries that responded to the El Nino, and then was adding in kind of what was going on in the other countries. So the reports that we saw on private-public partnerships were not, I want to say they weren't as significant, at least as they were coming across in the reporting. And so there seemed to be the start of those activities. And I think another aspect of it was that those activities weren't started until maybe the 3rd year, or really ramped up until the 3rd year in trying to identify those private-public partnerships. And so one of the recommendations that we would have as far as going back to that Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus framework is that those types of things would be thought about and established at least the how are we going to do this kind of from the very beginning of implementation of the project, which may be difficult if it's a humanitarian response, right? It's hard to start thinking about private-public partnerships when you're just trying to get this basic necessity to people, but that's where we saw that, you know, the private-public partnership started to come into play, at least as reporting on more so in that year 3, and that and we didn't really see a lot of that going on, at least predominantly in those 5 countries. And then there was other aspects of that going on in the other countries. Pascal or Kella, do you have any? Pascal, you have comments?
Yes, I think I can quickly add on to what you've just said, Anne. I think reflecting on what I just saw from the context of, first of all, the proposals and the reports that we were able to look at. Yes, I think there was this indication that, yes, the project would be trying to leverage the public-private partnerships as a way of support and resource mobilization. But then, in terms of the final reports, Anne clearly has observed that this did not reflect a significant contribution or impact, although I would still highlight a few that seemed to have shown, well, there was a bit of it going on, where, of course, individuals or private businesses did offer in some particular country or local context some support for the project as it was going on. But I think what looked more significant in this relationship was the reliance on the project, or rather of the project, on maybe some aspects like supply of required project materials and items for implementation, for example, things to do with food supply or maybe storage facilities and things like that, where it was a business model in which there would be a win-win situation for either the private business partner or the project in terms of getting things for implementation. But in terms of raising resources, I think I would say this didn't show rather quite significantly in the reports. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pascal. We have another question regarding food, and it's coming from Ruby. I think Ruby from Malawi. I may be wrong, but yeah. So Malawi was, I think, one of the schools that one of the countries that participated. So I may be wrong, but Ruby, if that's you, thank you for the question. She says, how does ADRA ensure that the food given to the pupils is balanced? Based on the report, did you see any anything about, let's say, you know, the nutrition being balanced? Was it well reported, or how did you find that in your research?
I guess I can take that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw there was significant effort, I think, to ensure that the meals were balanced. When the meals were being provided by Rise Against Hunger, as I understand it, and they were kind of packaged, those meals, obviously, there was already the nutrition content in there. It makes it harder when it is more locally provided to assess what the meal content is. But there was an effort to make sure that the food groups were represented. I know there was discussion on the number of food groups that should be represented, and what is the actual number that should be provided versus what was able to be provided. And so, yes, those things are coming across in the reports, and was reported, and it is acknowledged that it can be really difficult to assess that when you're obtaining the food locally.
Exactly. And sometimes there are disruptions in the food supply, but yeah, so all these are affected. I know that there are not, let's say, within the school feeding projects, but I know that a lot of times, let's say, by the time the proposal is approved, to have a balanced diet, come to find out that it's something that we cannot, let's say the supply is not available because of the crisis on the ground, so they had to switch different food. So yeah, this is something I know that it's critical to have a balanced diet. We're near the end of I guess the hour block where we, let's say, for the Q&A session to end, but I just want to pause and let you know that we will keep the discussion going further. For those who have even more technical questions that they want to ask, we want to stay further. We will stay. I also wanted to invite you to our Hub community of practice for education, because one of the things that was highlighted was about indicators. So if you want to know more about our past webinars, we had one on indicators. So I invite you to join our Hub group, where we post those resources, and also past webinars like this one we're going to post on our Hub platform. So I guess with that, if you have to leave, feel free to leave. We still gonna address some more questions if you have any. But I want to open the floor for more questions at this time, and you feel free to put them on the chat. One question that I did see, or one comment that I did see, was coming from John about the need for wash. If I understand it correctly, water was very critical, let's say, for the success of this project, and what would be, let's say, the value added, let's say, to have in all the school feeding programs, let's say, a constant source of water. Is that something that, let's say, you would recommend for us to always couple, let's say, school feeding with a wash component that makes water always available for children and students, I meant?
Yes, and that's one of the things that we recommend in the research, actually adding when they discuss, I want to say when I can't recall now from the research if it was the Sustainable Development Goals or if it was the International School Feeding Initiative, but they did not mention WASH as a component of school feeding, and yet WASH is integral to school feeding. If we're talking about children readiness to learn, that means that they're not sick, and obviously not having access to clean water can cause illnesses. And there is also another component. I actually, on another research project that I worked on in the WASH sector, that talks about dehydration. And so there's the aspect of nutrition and cognitive abilities, but there's also dehydration can impact that as well. And so it's really critical that there be clean water available for not only for cleaning food, washing hands, keeping areas clean, but also for drinking water, and so for the overall health. And so we do recommend that WASH be linked to the school feeding initiatives. And I saw the note about making sure that disability inclusive school facilities are there. I saw that comment. This is also this also came up in the research that I did. It's actually a book that's published. It was recently published. It's a chapter in a book. And it also discusses making sure that school facilities are conducive to children, to smaller children. And so that's why it's important to get the children's voices, to hear what they're experiencing, and so to make sure that those facilities are accessible for them.
Well, just quickly, to add on to what Anne just said in regard to the WASH recommendation, of course, when we look at this particular context, but also the general context of food, school feeding initiatives, was for practical reasons, but also for the broader context, fits in it, already highlighted in some of the aspects that Anne mentioned, but already also earlier, we did hint that even at the stage of this project, it became noticed that it was already crucial because water would be needed for preparation of food, water would be needed by the children that are taking or eating this food, and that makes it rather practical. Then on the other hand, WASH is a whole huge sector on its own. That means, therefore, when you think about a program for school feeding, then there's also need now to conceive of it with the idea that this WASH component has to be added, but in a way that it is also a huge component on its own, because then, as we already indicated in our sharing of the report, there would be things like how to train students on aspects of school hygiene, because the WASH component is there, which is a huge sector by itself, and how to take care of that as maybe a more sustainable approach, which would again require investments in terms of the WASH infrastructure that is required. Here, of course, we have already seen things coming up like installation of water facilities, but also installation of things like the school latrines, which are again part of this, because it kind of forms a whole complete chain when you are feeding children to have latrines, to have water facilities, and then that context seems to be a combined thing. So I just wanted to stress a little more on what Anne said, that for such an intervention, WASH becomes really necessary. Thank you.
And I just wanted to quickly highlight John's other point of really ensuring that schools have their own water supply for sustainability. This really goes back to ensuring that those indigenous water fetching methods are centered and are prioritized. We saw, I believe, in Eswatini that by the second year, water circulation systems were implemented to support hygiene, to support food in the kitchen. And so by putting those systems in place, it really does enable students to go to school to learn and not have to worry about carrying liters of water from home to school as well. It really just allows for there to be an environment that is focused on learning, while also centering these practices that are indigenous to the community, that are contextual, and are then going to be avenues that the community can participate in to really support the well-being of the learners.
And I'll just add one last component to this, to the WASH, which is related to the humanitarian-development-peace component, and specifically peace. In this context, there were issues where there were disagreements over access to water, and so this is an area where that peace component can be applied in an effort to generate more the word's not coming to me, sorry, to just generate more collaboration, generate that ability to work together to be able to provide the resources to the community. And so that's where, that's one of the aspects of this piece is being able to build that up and try to avoid conflict over resources such as water.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I also see it as critical, like if especially for those who are in other countries, country offices that are thinking about school feeding, that besides, let's say, the previous recommendations of that are more programmatic, I think one that's practical and necessary is always coupling, let's say, the school feeding with a WASH component that not only takes into account the people who are disabled and need access, let's say, to those facilities, but also having a constant source of water that's reliable in order to ensure that let's say the ability, let's say, to cook, the ability to wash your hands and be healthy is included. And I think that's something we, at least in the program sector, we miss. That, let's say, when we focus on food, we think food by itself, but in order to have, let's say, a healthy food or distribute it, then you need, clean water. And if you don't have access to clean water, that would be an issue to address. And while we're talking, I do notice that there are some people from the school feeding initiative country offices that are here. If you want to share your experience, let's say, especially when it comes to things that pertains to WASH, what were your experience? I see David, Ruby is still here, James. I don't know if any of you want to share some examples of what you had to face, especially when it comes to water, and using water being a critical component of school feeding. Well, I guess they're all shy, but
Ruby here.
yes, hi,
Ruby.
Ruby. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I'm not coming from one of the implementing offices, but I was actually working in a country where we were actually implementing an education in emergency by ADRA. So there was no school feeding program. There was a school feeding program by another organization. What ADRA had done there was to provide water for that school. So actually, when I saw that question, I think these two go hand in hand, because when the children would receive the food, they would go to the water point where they would really want to wash their hands before they start even having the food. Even though the food was not balanced, it left me feeling, like it's not enough. But that was another organization. ADRA had put water there, but the food given to the students, some of them didn't even come to eat it because it was not something that was attractive or palatable. It was just water and some cereal, which wasn't balanced. So actually, the two can go hand in hand. If there is food and no water, it will not be something that is good for the children. And even if there is water but there is no food, still something is lacking.
Thank you, Ruby. I think James was also trying to say something.
Well, my comment is related to Ruby's. Most of the school feeding activities, I think in this region, particularly the Horn of Africa, is happening in countries that have experienced drought. And it was very interesting during my engagement with emergency response in these countries to discover that even mothers of these children in these situations, they value water. They look at water as number one need. In comparison with the food, for the first time, that's what I could get, especially in Somalia and Ethiopia. So there is a very thin line between water or wash and then food provision. So I think there is need to consider that, because if they can't, for example, have clean utensils because they cannot have the water to wash them, they can't wash their hands, then we might be causing a bigger problem than solving it. And so I think it needs to be given attention in those dimensions in the future if we are going to continue with this program, the WASH aspects of school feeding.
Great. Thank you, James. Anne, yeah.
Yeah, and if I can ask a question myself, I think that's one of the things that we were wondering about too, is that WASH is integral, and yet these areas, well, some areas are dealing with flooding, which is another issue, and then some areas are dealing with drought. And so we were wondering, and that's why we speak about the indigenous practices and wondering what is the historical context of drought within these countries, and are there indigenous practices when droughts have occurred that have been developed that could maybe help in these areas? And so but you're on the ground, you can speak to what the experience is with drought and access to water.
Yeah, and that's very critical, because I know that well, there's also the issue of climate change, because I know that there are the indigenous practices sometimes are, digging wells, but those wells, the water, I think aquifer or the water level has dropped so significantly that yeah, those indigenous practices cannot be practiced because of climate change. But I've also seen how communities, they have those indigenous practices. I think in Sudan and Mauritania, that they have like I forgot the name of it, but basically it's creating a sort of reservoir, and the reservoir, I think they fill it with sand, and the water collects itself. Like basically it's like a desert reservoir, but it's man-made, and it has a way of holding the water as long as possible through droughts. And these are things that we need to also be let's say implement in the projects. And I'd say with the triple nexus, it's even more critical that local offices know that they have a voice on the table. Like a lot of times the donors or those, let's say, who'd love to implement, they have an idea that this is maybe the only way, or they may overlook some things. So I think there is also a component of advocacy that is needed and also welcomed to advocate that yes, we want to do a school feeding, we want to do this or that, but in order to do that, we need to implement some that WASH component or this indigenous practice in order to make the project sustainable. So ADRA, I know, is definitely a big support of the triple nexus. So it is also an opportunity, let's say, for country offices or field offices staff to voice their opinions, especially in those times of designing projects or recommending certain practices, activities, that it is now is a great time, let's say, to highlight these. James, I saw your hand up. Did you still want to comment?
Just to add, I think talking about indigenous knowledge, we should also maybe even take it a step further to talk about localization. To what extent are we considering local solutions and involvement of the local people? Of course, we've just talked about the private sector, but I think also looking at players in the local context, in what solutions they could have that would probably help with the situation would be a good thing. So I'm just raising the point of saying, okay, how is the localization agenda in this aspect of school feeding, and how helpful would it be in probably providing a solution in a sustainable sense? Maybe that needed to be looked into in the future.
Certainly, James, I think that's a question that I think we all are interested in, and how to make school feeding in the local context sustainable. One thing that needs to be transparent is that it costs a lot of money to run a school feeding in schools. The direct result of school feeding is more school attendance increases. So with more children coming to school, now you need to feed more children because more of them are coming. I want to say that's a great problem to have. It's a problem, but it's a good problem to have too many kids to feed in school because they are in school and not out in the streets. But the reality is that it costs a lot to sustain, let's say, schools. So involving the local community on finding, let's say, those sustainable ways in order to supplement or complement, let's say, the need for something sustainable is critical. Kenya, I think, had a school feeding program for a number of years, and they managed to actually have it to hand off the project, let's say, to the local community. And that's something that, we can look into. Togo, I know, is running a school feeding program. And what they did is, historically, the government took over, let's say, the country's school feeding program, and was basically the main coordinator. It still costs a lot of money, but, could that be maybe some examples of sustainability where community organizations or government organizations may be, let's say, collaborating with them so that when the transition comes, it comes with a sustainable component. So these are great questions and things that we need to look into. All right.
If I can just
yes, Anne.
Yeah, if I can just add, one of the things about the long-term sustainability on these transitions from external support and help to to basically building up the infrastructure and the ability for the country itself to provide school feeding. Just to give a perspective of it, in most of those cases that we saw, it can take up to 20 years to do that transition. And so it's a long-term investment to be looking long-term down the road to eventually having communities being self-sufficient to be able to provide the program. And so so not to think that this is a short-term, project, this is really needs the investment, the longer-term thinking of providing the program and developing the infrastructure.
And thank you, Anne. And I think that's great. And I see Rutendo put in the comment that the need for, let's say, to continue this research and compare, to do some comparison analysis with what others are doing. Well, he's talking about, water, but I think it also highlights what are other organizations doing too, in order to look into the idea of sustainability. Can we do more research on how are others, making school feeding sustainable? What are some indigenous practices that they've adopted, let's say, to make that happen? So these are, I guess, part 2 of the research to look into that. And that's something that we don't know yet if we're going to be able to continue the research, but these are some of the things that we can investigate more on. What are other organizations doing and what can we learn from them? So yeah, thanks for that comment, Rutendo. If any more questions before we wrap up, it'll be great to hear maybe one more or a couple more questions. Okay. I see Kwame and Dorcas. You have put some great comments. Would you mind sharing with us over the mic those comments, and we can discuss them more?
Hi, Billy.
Hi, Dorcas. How are you?
I'm good, and everyone else. Yes, my comment was on the contributions that the communities are making to the schools. Like I said, it's not much, but we have seen that there are communities, the parents actually, that have taken it upon themselves to contribute what they have in terms of school feeding. In Eswatini, we do have school feeding we are complementing what the government is doing in the country. So we do have a school feeding project that is funded by the government. So we're just complementing. So you find that there are times when the government delays in delivering what they are supposed to deliver. So what the parents do now is they just contribute the basics, like the grains, and then there's cereals, and then they take that to the schools. It's not much. It doesn't last long, but it's just something that they took upon themselves to do, just to try and help the situation in schools. And what we have also tried to do, because mostly these are the parents we have 3 constituencies. In one constituency where it's worse off than the other 2, it's very dry. Like now it's dry. You just breathe hot air. And thinking of going to those schools, you really have to have an air-conditioned car. You just can't go there. So we were trying to sell the idea to the other 2 constituencies if they could also take it upon themselves, because we normally have parents meetings, capacity building events with the parents. So we are trying to sell the idea just to probably try and sustain the project if we happen to leave. So yeah, that's what I was just trying to highlight in that comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorcas. That's yeah, that's a great point that you're making. And to me, it sounds that there is an advocacy component that has to be tied into it, where I guess because of climate change and how the conditions that were before are not there anymore, that partnering with advocating, let's say, for those resources would need to be added or implemented. So the example that you give for Eswatini, the parents doing their part, or at least helping, is something that's much appreciated. It can get to the point that they can't help anymore because of, let's say, something that's out of their control. So advocating for those who can help, let's say, in that aspect, I think is really really critical. So thank you for that. Anybody else? Kwame, I think you are highlighting is it you're saying in Togo there is a way of advocacy, let's say, with WFP. Did you want to share more on that?
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry for my English. I'm French people.
No problem.
Yeah, but I will try. Thank you very much. What I was trying to say is that in Togo, water access is a real problem for most schools. And I luckily have to work on the same project with World Food Program. And what I notified in that time is that they try to find a way to provide water for schools, because we all know that students need water to wash their hands, and water is also needed for the cooking. So we also know that ADRA especially is working on hygienic aspects for his project. So I just would like to ask ADRA to try for the next year to have a regard for these aspects. The water supply, the water access aspect for the schools is very important.
Thank you, Kwame. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you highlight, let's say, the what others have been saying is that it's very difficult to have water, what is it, the school feeding program or initiative without access to water. So having those two components, food and water, and others too, but the water is critical, let's say, for school feeding. And it's great to hear that Togo is already seeing that. I want to say that with the school feeding initiative, let's say we've had in different contexts, it's something that, let's say, hasn't been prominent, let's say, in the need to include water. But now that we have documentation that no, it is it's everywhere. Like I'm looking at the comments that like in Madagascar and also in Zimbabwe, yeah, Rutendo and also Nivo highlight that schools that have constant water supply, they perform better in a sense. So these are things that, let's say, now we know. So when we go to the next phase of, let's say, starting a new project or improving on another project for feeding, school feeding in schools that, we can implement that and we can advocate for it. And also when it comes to partnership, maybe we don't need to do all the school feeding if, let's say, WFP is like in Togo is already not WFP, but sorry, if, let's say, any other country that the government or another organization is already doing one part of the school feeding, we notice that water is not there, we can assume that they're having an issue, and maybe we can partner with them to supply water, because I know ADRA is good with wash, so that, let's say, the school feeding can be more sustainable in those schools. So thank you for the comment. All right, I guess if there's anything else, you're welcome to. Yes, we will wrap up. We will continue the discussion on HumHub, ADRA's Facebook version of let's say, for us to keep in touch. And we have put some of our webinars and also the report there. This webinar will also be posted there. So I encourage you who are part of the network to sign up and join our community of practice on HumHub. And any resources, we will try to develop, let's say, the report in something that's more digestible, let's say, when it comes to reading. And so we will work on that. And anything relating to news about, let's say, the school feedings and other locations that are doing that, also post your programs. Like in Togo, if you have any reports, share your experience also on our HumHub platform. So we really appreciate you for coming, and a special thanks to Anne and Kella and Pascal. Pascal had to drop off, but we really appreciate you for the work that you've done in conducting the research. We definitely want to continue it again. We just need to find, let's say, a way to sustain those research long term. But thank you so much for your participation. And for those of you who are still around, feel free to share your thanks and emojis of appreciation to the research team for their great work in the school feeding research.
And I just want to say thanks to all the ADRA staff that that helped us. Thank you for your reports, because I know it's challenging to do those reports as well as being implementing the projects. But then also thank you so much for your time in the interviews and sharing your experiences with us. We really appreciated that.
Yes, I concur. Kella, yeah.
I was going to say, echoing everything that Anne said, I think the work that you all did with the proposals and the reports really allowed us to see what was going on in the ground, and we couldn't be there in person and really develop this report. So thank you for all of your time and your energy and your effort.
Definitely. Yeah, I guess if anybody wanted to share any final thoughts, now is the time. We'll give you a few seconds. Okay, if not, thank you everyone for coming. Please follow up on HumHub for the recording of this session, of this webinar, so that you can share it with your colleagues. We really appreciate you for staying along, and also all that you learned, feel free to share it with your colleagues, and in how to improve the school feeding initiative. Download the report if possible. And yeah, I guess, now the ball is on your court. So thank you, everyone. Have a blessed day, and we'll chat again on the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Billy. Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Kella. Really
Bye.
appreciate it.